Welcome to the Jesus Movement. Good evening to everybody who's joining us online tonight. It's great to have your company with us. Tonight, Wednesday nights, we are continuing on with our Journey to Faith series. This week we are in lesson number 38 at this point in time. The lesson's called The Pursuit of David. So we're following the genealogy of Jesus. And of course, David is the future king at this point in time. At this stage of our journey, we meet up with the story where David's father was last mentioned in the Bible, and so we move on from Jesse in the genealogy of Jesus now to David, who's the 14th descendant who's listed in the genealogy of Jesus. The story thus far has been about David's decision to flee from King Saul, who's got an evil spirit put upon him by the Lord. He disobeyed the Lord, and David decided to take off. So last week we went through what happened there and where he ended up hiding, and we find him now in the southern part of Israel. He was hiding initially in some caves, and he was told by the prophet Gad not to hide anymore but to go out. And so we pick up the story from there tonight. Tonight's going to be very enjoyable, I pray, because we've got a number of lovely pictures from Israel for you about all the locations. We have maps and illustrations, and we have a few video clips for you to enjoy of these places as you can see them today. So you'll get a real opportunity to bring to life the scripture and to learn what the Bible has to share with us. So we're going to pick up with Abiathar. Now Abiathar is actually the son of the high priest called Ahimelech, and he fled to join David. So Ahimelech was the priest that David went to see when he left to go on his journey, and he went north of Jerusalem to Nob, where the priestly quarters were, and he asked for food and a sword, and he was given those things, and then he left. But of course it got found out that David had been there, and the consequence of that was that King Saul came up with his men, and Ahimelech and all of the other people there were actually slaughtered. So Abiathar, his son, was the only one who actually survived, and so as a consequence of this, he too fled to go and join David, who up until this point in time had approximately 400 people who had actually joined him. And David had also taken his parents across to Moab to have them protected by the king over there whilst he was fleeing from King Saul. So that's just a bit of background from where we start today. So Abiathar came running down to meet with David and his men, and when he arrived, he was given some water and a moment to catch his breath. He then told David what had happened, and David said to him in 1 Samuel chapter 22, verses 22 to 23. That's the first scripture for tonight. 1 Samuel 22, verses 22 to 23. He said, "That day, when Doeg the Edomite was there, I knew he would be sure to tell Saul, 'I am responsible for the death of your father's whole family. Stay with me, don't be afraid. The man who is seeking your life is seeking mine also. You will be safe with me.'" Importantly, Abiathar had taken a moment when he escaped to bring the ephod with him. So I'm going to ask you my first question for the night already. What is the ephod, and why did Abiathar bring it with him? Does anyone recall?
Priestly garment.
Right, it's part of the priestly garments, that's right. So Abiathar is the son of the high priest. So he is the next high priest, basically. So he had the sense that when he left, that he gathered together the priestly garments in order to be able to fulfill his office, even though he'd left King Saul. What this also tells us is that King Saul no longer had the priesthood beside him. And so part of governing and ruling in God's kingdom is that we have the leader, and then we also have the high priest, and they are to work together. One is to represent the people to the Lord, and the other is to represent the Lord to the people. And so we find here that by Abiathar taking the ephod and going to David, who'd already been anointed as a future king of Israel, suddenly we know that God was also with David. And so we find now the high priest, the priestly garments, and the Lord are all with David. And King Saul, with an evil spirit, is separated from all things with God. And so this is a small point, but a very significant point in the story. So not far from where David stayed with his men, he heard that the Philistines had been attacking his people at a place called Keilah. So I'm just going to pop up the last map from last week. Last week's lesson, as I said, it was called David as anointed king of Israel, but he's not king yet. And this is the, as I said, the last map that we were on. And this is that location that I just mentioned called Keilah over here. So it's in the, not in the hill country, and it's not on the coastal plain. It's in the changeover region on the escarpment as it actually heads up. This region in here, that a lot of the action's been happening with David, and we find that there's forests here, there's caves at Adullam, and so this is one of these areas of the Bible where there's much activity around David, and formerly there's a lot of activity with Samson in the same area. So the Philistines had been attacking the Israelites at Keilah and looting their threshing floors. He asked God whether he should attack these Philistines, and given permission, went to Keilah and fought them off. So we find here that David, even though he's not the king and he's separated from the king, he still wants to protect his people. He's still one of them. So even though he's on the run, he stops being on the run for a moment to go and sort out the Philistines. So King Saul heard of this, of course, and called up his forces to go down and to besiege David and his men. David learned of King Saul's intention and asked Abiathar the priest to bring the ephod and asked the Lord. So here's that purpose. Remember, part of the priestly garments was that they had the pouch that was inside the breastplate. Right, the Urim and the Thummim, and they sit in there. And this is when a question needs to be asked, it's actually asked of the high priest, and the high priest receives the answer from the Lord, and the answer is given back to the leader accordingly. David knows this, so of course David doesn't ask the Lord directly, he goes to the high priest, who's Abiathar. In 1 Samuel chapter 23 verse 11, he asks the Lord, will the citizens of Keilah surrender me to him? Will Saul come down as your servant has heard? O Lord God of Israel, tell your servant. And the Lord said, he will. So obviously his answer came through the high priest. David's men had swelled to 600 now, and he led them from Keilah, moving from place to place in the hills and strongholds throughout the desert of Ziph. And so again, back to the map. So here's Ziph, and this is this desert region. So everywhere from Beersheba here, this is the Negev, all this region. And so we're just right on the edge of this boundary of the desert area. So this is Ziph, where he's gone to now. So he's come up from Keilah, and here he is up at Ziph. Whilst David stayed at Haresh in the desert of Ziph, so I've marked that on there as well, so back and forth to the map. So there's Haresh, so you can see it's in that region, so very close by there. He not only learned King Saul was looking to kill him, but received a visit from his son Jonathan, who reassured him his father would not be able to do so. His visit renewed David's strength in God, and they again made another covenant before him. After Jonathan left, the people from Ziph went up to Gibeah to see King Saul at his palace. So again, back to the map. And so here's Gibeah on the northern side of Jerusalem. So all these places, we're not talking about a lot of distance, we're talking about 30 to 40 kilometres in this whole region here. So people are on foot, and they're going back and forth to the different locations. So King Saul has remained at his palace in Gibeah. So King Saul sent the Ziphites ahead of him to search out exactly where David and his men were, but David had moved to the desert of Maon. And so once again, back to the map, here's the desert of Maon. So notice he's just moved further away, a little bit deeper into the desert region and further away from where the king is. So he's just constantly moving in this direction. When they learnt of this and told King Saul, they set out to pursue David and his men. King Saul was travelling alongside one side of the mountain in this desert of Maon when David and his men were hurrying around the other side to escape. King Saul was gaining on David and his men when a messenger informed him that some Philistines were raiding their land. Despite being close on David's heels, King Saul broke off the chase to go against the Philistines. David and his men went from there to the strongholds in the desert of En-gedi. So here we have this pursuit going on of David, and we find that both David and King Saul will break off to fight against the Philistines. So first it was David, now this time it's King Saul. But when this happened, it said that he took off and he went to the strongholds in the desert of En-gedi. So here we are now. This is En-gedi. So En-gedi is actually on the edge of the Dead Sea, and this is what's known as David's stronghold. So we're going to, I'll just read a little bit further first, and then we'll show you some images along these lines. So after King Saul successfully pursued the Philistines, he was told in 1 Samuel chapter 24 verse 1, David is in the desert of En-gedi. He took 3,000 men to look for David near what's called the Crags of the Wild Goats, which is a reference from 1 Samuel 24 verse 2. The word En-gedi, does anyone know what En-gedi means? Anyone ever looked it up? En-gedi? No? All quiet? En-gedi actually means the spring of the kid. And when they're talking about a kid, they're talking about a goat. So a kid is obviously a very young goat. And evidence suggests that what this actually was actually an ibex, and they've always lived in and around the springs of En-gedi. And so you might ask, well, what does an ibex look like? And so here we go. So this animal, its correct Latin name is Capra ibex nubiana. So it's actually from Nubia, which is actually down in Africa, but they're throughout this region. This is a fairly young kid goat. The younger they are, obviously they don't have any horns, and their ears tend to be bigger versus their body. The thing is that they're very small. So they're just like the size of a goat, literally. They're not big animals at all. And so the Bible, when it talks about the wild goat and it talks about En-gedi, when you actually go to En-gedi, as we did, you see that they're actually there. And when you see that they're actually there, all the other references in the Bible talk about what they actually eat as well, and their main food source is acacia, whether they're little or big. Well, these are acacia trees. And so you can see this goat, you can see how big he is, you can see the table there, so you can see they're not very big. So we were here, and this goat literally ran up here, and in a couple of momentary seconds, it found itself up the top here. So it actually has these knobbly things on its front knees, and its front legs are shorter than its back legs. And what it does when it climbs, it actually bends the legs and elevates the back, so it's almost straight though it's sitting on an angle, and it actually bunny hops its way up the tree extremely quickly. And so whilst we were there, we saw one of these actually jumping up and climbing into the tree. But this is what an ibex looks like, and so this is what we understand to actually be the wild goats that they're talking about in the stronghold of King David. So go to Israel today, you'll see these, it's a national park, and you'll see them here today. So, well, hopefully you will. When we went there, we went all the way up to the top, up to the waterfall, we came all the way back down and there was none, so we were praying to the Lord, and lo and behold, when we got back down just before the car park, a whole herd of these things walked through the car park, and we had the pleasure of being able to take all of these photographs, so that was really lovely. Okay, so David and his men hid in the back of a cave next to some sheep pens, the Bible tells us, found amongst the caves in En-gedi. So we talked about the fact that the Dead Sea is below sea level, and the escarpment actually goes up to bring it back to the normal land level. So on the faces of these escarpments, they're littered with caves all the way up and down the Dead Sea. And it's the same caves at the northern end, not far from En-gedi, that the Dead Sea Scrolls were actually found. And so they found these sheep pens there, a place to protect the sheep. So they had heard that King Saul and his men were coming, and they couldn't believe it when the king came into the shadows of the cave to relieve himself. They whispered to David in 1 Samuel chapter 24 verse 4, "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give you your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish." So David's men they knew of this prediction. And I've got some references for you, and they're from 1 Samuel, and there's 3 of them. One in chapter 15, verse 28, a second one in chapter 16, verse 1, and a third one in chapter 16, verse 12. So I'll give you those again. 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 28, 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 1, and 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 12, beg your pardon. So David's men knew of this prediction, and Jonathan, the son of King Saul, spoke words that show clearly that these predictions were known. So these predictions come from 1 Samuel again, this time chapter 20, verse 15, and chapter 23, verse 17. So there's quite a few references around this. So it's also possible that the prophet Gad spoke this publicly in such a way that David's followers would know. You might remember the story tells you that Gad came and saw David. He had 400 men with him. So it would be quite reasonable to assume that when he spoke to him that there was others around that would have heard this as well. So David, hiding in the back of the cave while the king's relieving himself, decides that he's going to creep forward, screened by the sound of the king relieving himself. Brave man. Stilling his pounding heart and controlling his breathing, as you can imagine, David came up behind him, but he had no intention of killing him. He merely leant down and cut off a corner of the king's robe with his knife, and retreated back to his men in the shadows. David rebuked his men in 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 6, when he said, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lift my hand against him, for he is the anointed of the Lord." So David's talking here because his men were obviously suggesting to him that he should take the opportunity to kill him. And David's showing what an honourable person that he is, because he's saying that the Lord will take care of it in the Lord's way, in the Lord's time. And so it's not his place to do so. So David did not let his men attack the king, for he had become wounded by his own conscience. King Saul left the cave, and following him, David called out. You can imagine how surprised King Saul was. Showing him the cloth from his robe, the king understood that his life had been spared, and David told him in verse 12 of Samuel 24, "May the Lord judge between you and me. And may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me, but my hand will not touch you." How honourable is David. King Saul wept aloud, and he said in 1 Samuel 24, verse 17, and also verses 20 to 21, "You are more righteous than I. You have treated me well, but I have treated you badly. I know that you will surely become king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands." So there's a big statement. He's finally realised that David's next. Had someone told him that he'd been anointed, or did he just understand that God was on his side and it was going to happen? He goes on to say, "Now swear to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants or wipe out my name from my father's family." So he's now asking David to honour him where he didn't honour David. David gave his oath, however, to King Saul, and they parted ways. King Saul went back to Gibeah, and David went with his men to their stronghold in En-gedi. So I'm going to show you some pictures at this point in time of this stronghold. So these pictures, this is actually known as En-gedi National Park today. In this picture here, you can see in the background, this is actually Jordan on the eastern side of the Dead Sea, which is here. This is actually the pathway which goes back down, and there's a pathway which actually comes around the other side that takes you up. And so when you're at the bottom, you can see what it looks like. You wouldn't know there's anything up there. There's no way of looking at that you can see that there's a pathway up there. So you can see how well hidden it actually is. And yet coming back the other way, you can see that the pathway looks pretty straightforward. And so this is what it actually looks like. And this is known as Wadi David, or River David. Wadi means river. And so down the middle of this has actually been cut out by a river. Okay? So when we see this and all these boulders and erosion, it's caused by a river that ran down there. So by looking at that, we can assume that there's got to be some water somewhere up at the top. And so if we go to the next picture, there's a couple of pictures here that I've actually put. This first one actually shows on the way up there, they have all these reeds and bamboo, and you can see there's actually a tunnel through here. And my good friend Roger, who's here, there he is at the other end of the tunnel. He's always first. Roger always goes first and I always come second. So he's already gone through. So you can see there's all these different things where it's actually not obvious to see. If you were above on the escarpment looking down, you wouldn't see all of these things. And this waterfall, this is actually one of 6. This is the lowest one. So as you go further and further up the escarpment, you have these bodies of water. So you can see them working their way down through all the rocks and still cutting away to this very day. So nothing's actually changed. So as I said, there's actually 6 different waterfalls. And so I'm going to show you the actual waterfall on a video clip that I've taken there. And this actually shows you...
Just arrived at David's waterfall at Genealogy, so we've come all the way up the pass from the Dead Sea. It's all fine, and up here at the head with the top of the escarpment, the natural level of land up above here. So David came down from the top with 600 men and found this oasis of water. There seems to be a bit of a track that goes up here that's been blocked off to the left, and then when I pan around to the right, there's actually a path, and instead of green foliage there, there's a patches and there seems to be a path cut through the rock up there that goes up onto the platform and right up onto the top. So you see it probably wasn't that difficult to actually get down here, although it seems impossible from where we're standing. So, but this is it. This is where David came. Obviously, there's a source of protection here, source of water here, and let's have this spot where we are today. It's about 40 degrees, extremely hot. But when we come up here, the water's flowing, it's shade and the breeze, and it's really quite pleasant. So it's probably sort of down in the mid to high 20s. And significantly different, so very easy to understand why water comes in.
Now this is a film footage of Genealogy itself from where we're staying at the kibbutz. And you can see, so this is just a kilometre down the road, you see how arid it all is.
This is straight out of our front door. You'll see, so we have the stairs to the left. Goes up there.
So this sounds a bit ordinary because of the wind. So just to explain, this is the kibbutz here. This is at the back of where we're actually staying. And so this is actually facing towards the Mediterranean coast, and we're panning around. You can see this epic landscape that's here. So there's another watercourse here. And this is the top of the escarpment all the way around here as this pans across. So we're now turning towards the north. Up here, there's the Dead Sea on this side. That green zone up there is actually the national park we were just in, with the water that goes from there. And so you can see sorry, just get myself organised with my technical skills there. And so you can see from that second video that it's absolutely barren. And when you look at it from a distance, you've got this little bit of green in there, but it's really not very noticeable. The actual water that comes down, that's that waterfall, it actually doesn't come off the top of the plateau. It actually comes out of a spring, and it comes out from underneath and falls down. So if they were up at the top looking for David, all they'd see is this barren rock, and then they'd see the side of Jordan, or Moab as it was in the day, and they'd see the Dead Sea there, but there's no way, they wouldn't be able to see down. And so they were very secluded. But what a great spot David found. Here he is, he's got this abundant source of water. It's cooler than everywhere around it, and he's completely screened. They also happen to have goats on tap for a food source. And so, and so he was in a very good place that he was hiding.
But also strategically, if you have 600 men fighting against the army, they have to line up
Right.
and have to come up that path. So
Right.
from a defensive point of view, it's a brilliant strategy.
Yeah, very good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good, easy place to defend as well. And they also have an escape route, because if they're coming over the top, they can actually head all the way down to the Dead Sea and go either way as well. So it is a very good strategic spot to be hidden into. So I might just scroll back and leave the map on in the background there for that familiarity. So again, those film footage and the photos were taken here at En Gedi. Okay. So while they were holed up in this location, David received news that the prophet Samuel had died. So this is a significant time when he was there. He had to leave his stronghold, so he went northwards, up the way to Shur with his men to Ramah, and assembled with all the people of Israel to bury and mourn for Samuel. So Ramah is the place where Samuel had always lived, and so he's had to make his way from here up to Ramah. So he actually had to go past Gibeah to get to where Samuel was. So one would perhaps think that they maybe went the coastal way, or along the side of the Dead Sea and up, rather than across the top of the hill country where they were being looked for. So it's my estimate that Samuel died in 1012 BC, for the Bible tells us that David's journey will encounter several more trials and live in Philistine territory a year and 4 months before he is crowned the king of Israel in 1010 BC. So we're able to estimate when it was that Samuel actually passed away because of those details. So after Samuel's burial, David travelled back down south with his men, again stayed in the desert of Maon, looking for food and water to feed himself and his men. David sent 10 of them to a wealthy man named Nabal, who lived at Carmel and was shearing his 3,000 sheep. Once again, looking at the map. So here's Carmel here, so David's staying here now, and they just went a very close distance to Carmel, to where the sheep were. David asked for his favour, the Bible says, at a festive time. So in 1 Samuel chapter 25, verse 8, he said, "Please give your servant and your son David whatever you can find for them." So given David's message, Nabal said in 1 Samuel chapter 25 now, verses 10 to 11, he says, "Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. Why should I take my bread and water and the meat I have slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men coming from who knows where?" Nabal was a wealthy descendant of Caleb, son of Jephunneh. So that's the former leader of the tribe of Judah when they arrived in the land. And he settled in the valley of Hebron, which is where their inheritance was given to the family. And they had vast possessions in the south of Judah. Scripture reveals the exact number of his goat herds and sheep flocks, enhancing how mean-spirited his reply to David was. You see, David and his men had no provisions, and yet had been providing protection for Nabal's shepherds and flocks on the edge of the desert. On the occasion of annual sheep shearing for a rich master, festivities were usually provided for those who worked in any capacity for the master. It was in this context and on such an occasion that David sought the benevolence of Nabal. David's men returned empty-handed and explained what happened. David instructed his men in 1 Samuel 25 verse 13, "Put on your swords." Leaving 200 men behind with their belongings, David took 400 with him and set out to see Nabal. Before David could reach him, however, Nabal's wife Abigail was told by one of their servants how David and his men had protected them. He also spoke of the threat that now hung over Nabal and his whole household. So Abigail wasted no time and assembled a vast array of food and wine for David and his men and sent it ahead of her. She did not tell her husband, but set out to meet David herself and pled for mercy. David and his men were descending down a mountainous ravine when he spotted this woman coming towards them riding on a donkey. She looked at him and slid down off its back, and after pressing her face to the ground, she looked up and David could see how anxious she was. Fallen at David's feet was Abigail, the wife of Nabal. She said in verse 24 and 25 of 1 Samuel chapter 25, "My Lord, Let the blame be on me alone. May my Lord pay no attention to that wicked man Nabal. He is just like his name. His name is Fool, and folly goes with him. But as for me, your servant, I did not see the men my master sent." Abigail asked for David's forgiveness to atone for Nabal's denial of his request, to avoid the planned bloodshed that was to come as a punishment. She did not excuse her husband's conduct, nor did she depend upon her own reckoning, but she was very submissive and relied on God's grace, knowing that yielding should pacify such a great offence. Abigail proclaims her faith in David by foretelling the glorious end to his troubles. When we go to 1 Samuel chapter 25, verses 30 to 31, it reads, "When the Lord has done for my master," so she's talking to David, "every good thing he promised concerning him, and has appointed him leader over Israel, my master will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or of avenging himself." So she's making it clear that she understands that he will be the future ruler of Israel. And so she doesn't want him, in her words, to have the bloodshed of all of her people on his hands. And she wisely speaks of how sweet revenge in the heat of the moment will turn to bitterness and regret that cannot be undone at a later time. This is a message for all of us. When we are tempted to sin, we should consider the consequences of our actions and how we will feel about it afterwards. So often we can do things and we might excuse ourselves in the moment, but we have a conscience, and afterwards we're going to reflect on it and know that we did the wrong thing. And this, of course, is going to stain us and affect us. So David listened carefully to what Abigail had to say, and when she finished, he said in verses 24 to 25 again, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands." David accepted her gift of provision and returned to his stronghold. When Abigail returned to her husband, he was holding a banquet and had become very drunk. Waiting until daybreak the next morning, she told Nabal all that had transpired, and it says in Samuel 25, chapter 25, verse 37, "His heart failed him, and he became like a stone." We can understand from this that Nabal suffered a stroke, the symptoms of a heart attack. 10 days later, in 1 Samuel chapter 25, verse 38, the Bible says the Lord struck Nabal and he died. And that's why we talk about him having a stroke. One of the things about the word stone is what? Because when we have a stroke, often we lose mobility and our body goes rigid in some way, shape or form. And so this is what we understand it to be. So David praised the Lord when he heard of Nabal's death and sent servants to Carmel to Abigail to ask her to be his wife. Again she humbly bowed with her face to the ground and accepted David's offer. So at this point in time now, David has 2 wives. Right? He has the second daughter of King Saul, and he now has Abigail, whom he's just married. The second daughter of King Saul, of course, her name is Michal. As time passed, David's movements brought him out of his stronghold. He was spotted again by the people of Ziph on the edge of the desert plateau above. Some of them went north to King Saul again at his fortress in Gibeah to report his whereabouts. And in 1 Samuel 26, verse 1, he says, "Is not David hiding on the hill of Hachilah, which faces Jeshimon?" So David had been camping with his men in the desert of Ziph. Now I haven't got those specific details on this map because it's in this vicinity just here, but there's no evidence to know exactly which hill it actually was, but we know it's just around here somewhere on the map. So David had been camping with his men in the desert of Ziph when a messenger brought news of King Saul arriving again with 3,000 men. David sent out scouts to confirm of his arrival and of his whereabouts and went with his men to where he was camped. David saw where King Saul and his commander Abner, son of Ner, laid down to sleep at night. As expected, his army camped around him for protection. So David asked Ahimelech the Hittite and Abishai, son of Zeruiah, who would go down into the camp with him at night. Abishai volunteered. That night, under the cover of darkness, David and Abishai walked straight through the encampment of soldiers until they came up to King Saul. His commander Abner and many soldiers were lying all around him, but none of them stirred, for the Lord had put them into a deep sleep. Abishai spoke to David in a hushed tone. This is in 1 Samuel chapter 26, verse 8. Spoke to him in a hushed tone, "Today God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Now let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of my spear. I won't strike him twice." So once again, those who are with David want to kill King Saul. But David forbid him. Refusing to lay a hand on the king, he trusted the Lord and would not strike a man anointed by God. Instead, he instructed Abishai to take the king's spear and water jug and leave. They left in the opposite direction from where they came because David did not want King Saul or his men to follow them back to their camp. Climbing to the top of a hill some distance away, he turned and called out to Abner and the army. When Abner responded and asked who was calling, David chastised him and told him that he and his men deserved to die for not protecting the king. For proof, he asked, in 1 Samuel 26, verses 16 to 18, "Look around you. Where are the king's spear and water jug that were near his head?" Saul recognized David's voice and said, "Is that your voice, David, my son?" He calls him my son. David replied, "Yes, it is, my lord the king." David still acknowledges that he's the king. And he added, "Why is my lord pursuing his servant? What have I done and what wrong am I guilty of?" King Saul again confessed his sin, promised not to try and harm him again, and asked him to come back. But David did not trust him. Rather than go to the king, he asked for one of the king's young men to come and get his spear. David told King Saul in verse 23, "The Lord delivered you into my hands today, but I would not lay a hand on the Lord's anointed." King Saul blessed him. David left and the king returned home with his men. So this is the second time now King Saul's been spared by David, and here is the king blessing him for the second time. So King Saul had promised not to pursue David, but David did not trust him and thought it would be wise to go to the land of the Philistines where the king would not look for him. He led his 600 men, their families and his wives to Gath, which was ruled by King Achish. News that David had fled there soon reached King Saul, and he ceased looking for him. So I have a couple of pictures. I've shown you some on a previous week of Gath, but this is a couple of more pictures of ancient Gath here. So today in Israel, this is called Tel Es Safi. We can see here all of this wall that's actually constructed. In the time of the Canaanites and the Philistines, none of the blocks are actually dressed, and this is one of the ways you can tell the age of the rocks. There is actually Israelite stones here, but they're all dressed. So they have a cube shape or a oblong or rectangle shape. But they're not dressed. So this is the sophistication. So this is actually on Tel Gath when we're there. This is some of the excavated ruins that they've actually got. So you can actually see some of the sections of walls that they would have been at that time. And then over here on this particular picture, this is from on top of Gath, looking in a northerly direction. And it's just to show you again that you're up on top of this huge tell, this big mound or hill, and you can see the elevation gives you this view in a long distance. So they use these as fortified cities in order to protect themselves. Down here you can see these stone walls in sections here, all along here, and so this would contain their livestock in the environment around the actual city. So again, you can go to Israel and visit these places today. So David's fierce reputation as a soldier preceded him, so much so that when he arrived, the Philistines had no desire to fight him. David asked King Achish for a small town to live in, so he didn't need to live in the royal city of the king. He is given a town called Ziklag, Ziklag, to the south, where he lived for the next year and 4 months. I don't know if you've heard this news recently, but there's actually an archaeological dig at Ziklag right now. They believe they found the exact location of this. Is happening currently right now. They've actually found pottery and artefacts that dates it to the time of King David. And so this is another biblical location in Israel which has been yet undiscovered. And so on my map, and on another map that's yet to come, which I'll pop up now so we can show it, here's Gath, and I've got this mention to Ziklag. It's believed to be here somewhere, but as I said, it's literally just been discovered as we're talking at the moment. So I've just penciled this location in here, and here we are across at Gath there. Okay. So from Ziklag, David and his men raided the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites who dwelt in the Negev desert. They left no man or woman alive, the Bible tells us, but they took the livestock and clothes and brought them to King Achish at Gath. In this way the king grew to trust David and believed that he would be his servant for all time. So whilst David lived in the Philistine territory, the Philistines were gathering their forces to fight against Israel. This is going on in the background. One time, whilst David was in Gath, King Achish approached him, and he said in 1 Samuel chapter 28, verses 1 to 2, "You must understand that you and your men will accompany me in the army." David said, "Then you will see for yourself what your servant can do." Achish replied, "Very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life." So obviously, this Philistine king has no idea of what is really going on. Okay, so David's playing along with this because he's receiving protection from King Saul at this point in time. So the Philistines combined to raise an army to go up against King Saul and the Israelites. They assembled at a place called Aphek, which is located here on the coastal plain. All the Philistine kings, excepting for King Achish, rejected David and his army, who are sent home. The Philistines go to their camp in a place called Shunem and battle against King Saul and the Israelites, who camped at Gilboa. The Israelites are beaten, and King Saul and his son Jonathan are killed. So this is the background we're about to read into. So up here, this is Shunem, and this is up the Jezreel Valley. This is Gilboa. It's actually a mountain, and I'll show you some pictures for this in a moment. So they've gone all the way up here to engage in this battle. When David returned home, the Amalekites, he found, had destroyed and burnt Ziklag. So there's two stories going on at the same time here. There's David in his journey, and we've got King Saul up north about to have this battle and die against the Philistines. And they destroyed and burnt Ziklag to the ground and taken their wives and children. David pursued them down to what's known as the Besor ravine, through which the Besor river flowed. Defeating them, he rescued their wives and children. So again, we're going to go into the story a little bit more, but this is where this is. This is the Besor River. It flows right out to the coast of the Mediterranean. Here it is here. And there's this gorge here. So this is where they came down for that battle on there. So the Bible tells us that David and his men marched with King Achish and his Philistine army. They initially went to Aphek to assemble with all of the other Philistine kings. From Aphek, the Philistine kings marched together with their units of hundreds and thousands in a show of strength, travelling northwards to engage the Israelites in battle. David fell in marching with his men behind King Achish at the rear. So the other commanders of the Philistines noticed David and his men were at the rear behind the army of King Achish. And so they say in 1 Samuel chapter 29 verse 3, "What about these Hebrews?" Achish replied, "Is this not David, who was an officer of Saul, king of Israel? He has already been with me for over a year, and from the day he left Saul until now, I have found no fault in him." The Philistine commanders were not happy with this, though. They did not trust David and believed he would turn against them in battle. They inquired in verse 5, "Isn't this the David they sang about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands." So that dance and that song is known by the Philistines, we find out at this point in time in the Bible. So news has travelled through the land. King Achish called David and told him that although he had found no fault in him, he would have to return to Ziklag because the other rules didn't approve them. David protested, and King Achish reiterated that the other commanders did not want him to go with them to battle. So you can imagine David protesting, saying, no, we want to go, when in reality he's like, yippee, we're going home, you can all go and fight against King Saul. Perhaps he had an understanding what the battle was for, and he didn't want to be there anyway because King Saul was about to be taken care of. So David rose early the next morning with his men, and he went back to the land of the Philistines. And the Philistines went up to Jezreel, as I said, and camped at this place called Shunem, next to Mount Moreh in the north. King Saul assembled the Israelites and set up camp on the opposite side of the Jezreel Valley at Mount Gilboa. So these are all these locations again. Up here on the map, here's the Jezreel Valley, which runs from the Jordan River, Beit Shean, at its junction. It goes through, there's Mount Moreh, goes through the Jezreel Valley and heads right through to the coast. This is Mount Carmel up here. Megiddo, the future Armageddon's on the side of the Jezreel Valley here, and Mount Tabor on the other side. So all of this action is going on. There's a mountain on either side, and the battle, of course, happens in between, which is quite normal with ancient battles. They would get vantage points from both sides and go down into the valley to fight one another. And so that all happens up there. So King Saul assembled the Israelites and set up camp, as I said, on the opposite side of Mount Gilboa. He was terrified when he saw the Philistine army, and in 1 Samuel 28 verse 6, he inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him by dreams or Urim or prophets. Well, we know why that is, because Abiathar had the Urim, and he was with David. And so he had no one to actually consult. There was no one left around him. So with no answer, although he had expelled the mediums and spiritists from the land after Samuel had died, he asked his attendants to find a medium. So here he is. He resorts now to evil. He's no longer, he hasn't heard from God, so now he's going to find a source that's evil. They knew of one in a place called Endor, and she was between Mount Moreh and Mount Tabor to the north of their encampment. And so there's Endor there, where that yellow spot is up there, right at the top there. So not far away from where they were assembled. So King Saul disguised himself and went to see her in the night. When he met with her, he asked her to bring up the spirit of Samuel. Samuel appeared and told King Saul that both he and his son Jonathan would die the next day, and that the kingdom of Israel had been given to David because he had disobeyed the Lord. So he got this concrete word. David and his men travelled south for 3 days whilst this was happening. And as we mentioned earlier, they arrived in Ziklag and found it had been destroyed by fire. And their wives, sons and daughters were nowhere to be seen. So you can just imagine all of these men that were with David. He knew them all personally, and suddenly all of their families have actually been murdered while they're away. But they began to turn on David. They were bitter in spirit and began to talk about stoning him. So the usual thing happens. He was their leader, they went with him, they turned around and came back. Their families have been murdered, and so they're looking for a scapegoat, someone to blame, and so they turn on David. So David became very distressed, but steadied himself as he found strength in the Lord. Turning to Abiathar the priest, the son of the former high priest Ahimelech, David commanded him in 1 Samuel 30 verse 7, "Bring me the ephod." Unsure what to do, David sought the Lord. And in verse 8, he said, "Shall I pursue this raiding party? Will I overtake them?" So the Lord, so in other words, here's David, he's still got faith that they're going to be okay. Right? The rest of them think that they're all dead, but David's saying, no, maybe we can still do something. So the Lord told David to pursue them, their families had been taken, and he would succeed in their rescue. Hastily marching to the south, David's party gained to the Besor ravine, where the Besor river flowed down from the Negev that I pointed out. They pushed so hard that many of the men were exhausted, so 200 stayed on the northern side of the ravine with most of the supplies, while 400 others followed David across the other side in pursuit. Striking further south, they came across a field where they encountered a man who was starving for food and thirsting for water. He hadn't had anything for 3 days, so they met his needs and asked him who he belonged to and where was he from. He explained that he was Egyptian and had been the slave of an Amalekite that was a member of the raiding party who had struck Ziklag and taken their people. So So David asked him in verse 15 of 1 Samuel 30, "Can you lead me down to the raiding party?" He answered. "Swear to me before God that you will not kill me or hand me over to my master, and I will take you to them." So David and his men were led to where the Amalekites were spread out over the land. It was late in the day and dusk was looming. Interesting, isn't it? It's always the Amalekites. When the Israelites go somewhere, the Amalekites come behind and attack them. And so we find this again. So the Amalekites, you remember, they're the traditional enemy of the Israelites or the Jewish people. They were the ones who attacked them when they left Egypt many years ago. So it was late in the day and dusk was looming. The Amalekites were prepared for the evening and were eating and drinking in celebration of the plunder they had taken from Ziklag and other parts of Judah. David and his men engaged them in battle that raged from dusk until the evening of the next day. They were in great number, but only 400 were able to escape on their camels. David and his men recovered everything that had been taken, including their families, and returned with plunder of their own. Deeply contented with the outcome, David's men allocated him with a vast number of livestock. So as they came upon the 200 on their return, they left the rest and guarded their supplies. Many troublemakers amongst the raiding party did not want to share their plunder. David told them their success had been provided to them by the Lord and that they were to share alike. He also made this a statute and ordinance for Israel for all time. So we want to look at one of the important things that come out of this story. He actually sets this up as a premise for all battles for all times in the future. When they arrived at Ziklag, David also sent some of the plunder to the elders of Judah, who were his friends in the places where he and his men had roamed. So at this point, we go back to the Philistines. The Philistines had clashed with the army of Israel, and the Israelites fled before them. Many fell on Mount Gilboa, and the Philistines chased hard after King Saul and his sons. I'm just going to pop up this picture of Mount Gilboa. I'm about to show you a video in a moment. This is Mount Gilboa here. This picture is actually taken standing on top of Bayat Shean. This pointing up this way is the Jezreel Valley heading towards the Mediterranean, and this is Mount Tabor on the opposite side over there. So this is Mount Gilboa we're talking about. Excuse me. They first killed Jonathan, the Bible tells us, and his two brothers Abinadab and Malchishua before the fighting grew so fierce around King Saul that he was wounded by an arrow. King Saul knew that his time had come and asked his armour-bearer to kill him with his sword. But the armour-bearer was too scared, so King Saul fell on his own sword. The chariots and their riders were almost upon the mortally wounded king when he stood there and leaned on his spear. He turned around and saw a man standing there, and he called out to him. The man answered in 2 Samuel, so we've just moved into 2 Samuel chapter 1 verse 7. "What can I do?" King Saul asked him, "Who are you? An Amalekite?" The man answered. So King Saul said to him in 2 Samuel chapter 1 verse 9, "Stand over me and kill me. I am in the throes of death, but I am still alive." The Amalekite stood over King Saul, killed him and took the crown off his head and the band of authority off his arm. When the armour-bearer saw that King Saul was dead, he too fell on his own sword and died. Not a very happy place. So news of their defeat and the death of their king spread fast as the Israelites fled along the valley and across the Jordan River. Many abandoned their towns and the Philistines moved in to occupy them. Next day, when the battle was over, the Philistines went to the battlefield to strip the dead for plunder. King Saul and his 3 sons were found on Mount Gilboa. They stripped the armour from the king and cut off his head. Messengers then went throughout the land of the Philistines, and the news was proclaimed to their people and in their temples that held their idols. They took King Saul's armour and put it into one of the temples dedicated to Ashtoreth, and they took his beheaded body and the bodies of his sons and secured them to the wall of Bayat Shean. Again, I'm going to show a video in one moment. This is a picture of Bayat Shean as it looks today. This is standing on top, so on the reverse side here. This is how big this is. It is huge. It is monumental. And so this is actually the Palladium. So this is a Roman built road because they came here and built this city. Does anyone know what this city's name changed to? It was called Beit Shean, the House of Rest. It got changed during the time of Jesus by the Romans. It was one of 10 cities that had their names changed. They were in fact changed to Greek names. When the Greeks were there before them, the Romans kept the actual name. But this is the Scythopolis of the Bible. Okay? And so when you go here, you'll find there's a structure on top here, and it's actually an Egyptian governor's house, showing that the Egyptians were up here controlling this region. On top there's Canaanite ruins, there's Israelite ruins, and the Egyptian ruins, and down bottom you've got the Roman ruins, you've got some Greek, and you've actually got some Byzantine ruins in there as well. In fact, there's a Byzantine baptistry, a thing built into a wall where you baptise a child in a font. So all that's found in that place, so it's quite an incredible place. So just finishing here, so the people of Jabesh Gilead who lived nearby on the other side of the Jordan River held King Saul in very high esteem, it says in 1 Samuel 11, verses 1 to 11. And the reason was because he had rescued them from when they were under Ammonite attack in the past. When they heard what the Philistines had done to their king, their brave men went in the night to Bet-shean and took down his body and those of his sons. Returning to Jabesh Gilead, they burned the bodies and took their bones and buried them under a tamarisk tree and fasted for 7 days. So I'm going to put on these video clips so you can have a better look at these places. So we'll start with this one. This is of Beit Shean. So when you come to the entrance,
you come out of the visitor centre, just looking around here, you can see all the predominantly Roman ruins from here, but up in the background you can see the tell there, which the ancient Canaanite city was on. So when Joshua came through here, this is what they would have saw, and this is a great place to sort of get some scale here in terms of the height of these tells, as they call these mounds, ancient mounds. And just panning around here to the right.
This is actually the back of an amphitheatre.
Ruins in the background there, the hills, that's Jordan over there, so the river Jordan runs through the valley between the two, so we come down from the Sea of Galilee, running down the valley, following the Jordan River here to Bet-shean. So this is the junction point. This is the place. It's quite such a big settlement, I imagine. So from the time of the Egyptians all the way through, this is where you come across from Mount Carmel on the coast, up the plains, and then around Mount Carmel through the Jezreel Valley, then into the Harod Valley and across to the River Jordan here. And then this tell guarded the junction. So this was it. This was the junction of all trade. So as you go to the south, down to Jericho, down to Jerusalem, up through the hill country. That's basically behind me when I'm filming. And then I'm looking at it now on the other side going northwards, take up to the Sea of Galilee, Jordan River and the valley there to the right with Jordan on the other side. So they're the plains up there where King King Saul and King Og were overtaken with the Amorites when Joshua first came up. And then they fought all those territories of Bashan and Gilead. And that traces down that mountain range on the other side. Well, looks like a mountain range, but it just goes up to a plateau because, of course, the Jordan River cuts through and sinks it down on the Sea of Galilee. So it's just really nice. At the moment, we're here really early in the morning, so there's no one in the view. We're literally the first people in. And as I say, this is going to be an incredible view here, but that colonnade you can see through the middle, you can get a real sense of the scale and the size of this Roman city as it was in the end. But in this location, as we travel around, we should be seeing from the top of that mound on the tell, we should be seeing ruins from the Canaanites. Somewhere here there's some ruins from the Egyptians, and then of course we've got the Romans when they came through, but this place would have been passed through by all and sundry, so the Persians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, coming down from Jordan. This is the way we come down. This is like the junction. So if Jesus was coming down from the Sea of Galilee, he would have come down through here, and then going further south, he would have gone up onto the hill country and passed through to Shiloh, or Shechem before there, Shiloh, Bethel, Ai, all those places, Gibeah, and then down to Jerusalem. That's the way to Shur, and that would then follow through to Bethlehem, down to Hebron, through to Beersheba, and then across to Egypt. So it's nice to see how this topography and geography connects all these biblical places and get a real understanding of why they went the ways that they went and what was here. So this is a real joy. So just walk over here to the left.
So this is now on top of that
Set
mountain
view.
on the northern side.
Out the valley, heading back across to Megiddo, Jezreel, Mount Carmel, etc. to the coast, so you can see really clearly. So it's a big wide expanse.
Again, that's Mount Gilboa
Coming
here,
through here. You can
and
see
that's the
this
opposite side.
narrowing gap in front of me, where it sort of drops down in that tree zone and passes through a narrow gap, so you can sort of see, and as we pass around the other side here, you can sort of see that gap continues back in that shed area, and then out to the valley where the Jordan River is. So once again we can see this is a narrow sort of pass here, so everything had to come through past here, and of course we can see in every direction, to the east, to the west, the north and the south from on top of this hill. As we pan around this way, you can see all the hill country there as it rises up. And then as we keep going down this way, so down that way is to Jerusalem. So the road, the way of Shur as it was called, would go down from
These are these Canaanite ruins
across
here in the
into those
foreground.
hills, and then up onto the top of the hill country as it was known. And again, it would pass down through Shechem, Shiloh, then to Bethel and Ai, where Samuel lived, and past Gibeah into Jerusalem, and again down through Bethel and Hebron, Beersheba, and on to Kadesh Barnea and Egypt. So yeah, a great sense of the lay of the land from this.
Okay. All right. Well, I hope those videos, they give you a good sense of the layout there. You can see that these ancient tells, we keep talking about all these places in the Bible and these very large tells, as they're called, big mounds. The word tell, T-L, actually means mound. So they're a huge hill upon which they build a fortified city. They're all strategically located. That particular one, that's the place, that's the junction where everything happens to come from Israel to northern Mesopotamia down to Egypt. So that narrow valley that it just showed there, the trade would have to come through there. Of course, they'd have garrisons and soldiers and all the rest of it. They'd be extracting taxes from people. So right back to the time of Abraham, this place was operating, and so whoever was the ruler at the time would have been collecting taxes, and then people would actually stay there. So it's called Bayat Shean because it means the house of rest. So basically they would pay their taxes and have a good night's sleep under the protection of the ruling party there, and then they would continue on their way. But the good thing about there is these locations in the Bible for the story that we're looking at the moment. You can see Mount Gilboa there in the background, and you can see the sort of scale of the area of which they were actually fighting in. Okay, so just about to wrap up. So on the third day, so going back to David now to finish off, on the third day that David had returned to Ziklag after defeating the Amalekites, there was a man who arrived who was dirty, worn tall clothes, and fell at David's feet. We read about this in 2 Samuel chapter 1 verse 3. And David asked him, "Where have you come from?" And he explained how he had escaped from the Israelite camp of King Saul. He told David that the king and his son Jonathan were dead. David asked him how he knew, and he recounted how King Saul had asked him to end his life. He told David he had brought the king's crown and armband to him, so there's that person who took them from him. David and his men tore their clothes and wept. They mourned until the evening for the king and his son, and they mourned for the Lord's army and the house of Israel. So we see from this that this person had the intention of removing the actual crown and taking it to David on the understanding that he was to be the next king of Israel. So when David asked who he was, the young man said he was the son of an Amalekite and an alien amongst them. David also asked why he was not afraid to destroy the Lord's anointed and call one of his men to strike him down. David had said to him in 2 Samuel chapter 1 verse 16, "Your blood be on your head, your own mouth testified against you when you said, I killed the Lord's anointed." And so we find here this man tells of the news, brings him the crown, and then David strikes him down because he was associated with the death of the king who was anointed by God. And so David, to the last instance, still honouring what God had ordained. So soon thereafter, David asked the Lord, "Shall I go up to one of the towns of Judah?" This is in 2 Samuel chapter 2 verse 1. The Lord said, "Go up." David asked, "Where shall I go?" "To Hebron," the Lord answered. David and his wives, his men and their families left Ziklag in Philistia and went to Hebron and its surrounding towns and settled. The men from the tribe of Judah came to Hebron and anointed David the king of Judah. And so we find that once King Saul has been killed, that David is not actually crowned as the king of all of Israel at this stage, but firstly the king of Judah. Why Hebron? Does anyone know why Hebron would have been selected? Do you remember what Hebron was?
Abraham's
No.
burial place.
Yes, but not the reason why. Hebron was one of the 40 priestly cities that was appointed by God. So this was a place where he would have been able to be invested with authority from the priesthood. And so this is why. See, his hometown was actually Bethlehem. Right? So Bethlehem, I'll just give up that map. So Bethlehem being here and Hebron being here, Hebron was actually the closest priestly city to his land of inheritance. So he would have gone to this place in order to be invested in his office. And so that's what would happen there. So King Saul, who had been anointed as the first king of Israel at the age of 30, had ruled Israel for 42 years before being killed at the age of 72. David, born in 1040 BC, and anointed as the second king of Israel when he was still a boy, was crowned king of Judah at the age of 30 in 1010 BC. At the same time as this happened, in the south of the kingdom, the commander of King Saul's army, Abner son of Ner, took Ishbosheth, son of King Saul, to Mahanaim and made him king over Gilead, Asher, Jezreel, Ephraim, Benjamin, and all of Israel. So in effect, even though it hasn't been divided up as it would be in the future between the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel, this has happened right now. So we see from Jerusalem, this is on the border of the Benjamites. So basically from here upwards is being declared under one king, and from here downwards is being declared under David. Of course, all of this coastal territory is still not contained or ruled by anyone, so we're only talking about the hill country regions. So we find that the land is being contested for, and we also find here there's a lack of respect for David, who honoured King Saul, and they knew he was to be the next king, but they're not going to just give it over. So the fighting between the two sides carried on for a period of 2 years. During King David's rule from Hebron, he married, the Bible tells us, another 4 wives. Maacah, daughter of Tamai, king of Geshur, Haggith, Abital, and Eglah, and he fathered 6 sons, Amnon, Kileab, Absalom, Adoniah, Shephatiah, and Ithream, one to each of his 6 wives. And that's in 2 Samuel chapter 3, verses 2 to 5. And King David also gradually became stronger as King Ishbosheth weakened, and Abner, King Ishbosheth's commander, grew more powerful among King Saul's former supporters as his king lost ground. And an incident will occur that changes everything. So Abner, who was King Saul's cousin, is falsely accused of sleeping with a person called Rizpah, King Saul's former concubine, by King Ishbosheth. Incensed by these accusations and having given his staunch support for his king and his father, Abner's tongue gets the better of him. He is angry at this false accusation and makes clear he will change his loyalty. So he blurts out in 2 Samuel chapter 3 verses 9 to 10, "May God deal with Abner, be it ever so severely, if I do not do for David what the Lord has promised him on oath and transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul and establish David's throne over Israel and Judah from Dan to Beersheba." And so we draw to a close on this point. We find in tonight's journey that we have seen the end of King Saul's life draw to a close. We have Samuel the prophet's life has drawn to a close naturally of old age. And we see that David's anointing to rule was not just honoured by those who came against him. And so at this point in time where we come to a close, we find that David's being declared that he will be the future king over both Israel and Judah. And it says from Dan to Beersheba, so we're talking about the top of the north down to the bottom of the south. So we're talking about the whole of the land there. So we'll draw to a close on that note. So I just want to say thank you for everybody who's joined us online. I'll put this end screen on. I hope you enjoyed tonight. A lot of information. I pray that the videos and the maps and the information has helped you to understand this part of the Bible. So I look forward to your company next week. God bless. Stay safe. Thank you.
For what would truly satisfy.